elections tell us about voter priorities today? What do they tell us about identity, policy, backlash to polarization, and how might that reshape campaigns going forward? I will turn it to Professor Josephson, and then we will turn it to you, Professor Aziz.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and excited for the conversation. So just to get us started, the elections in New Jersey and Virginia, especially the off-year elections that are always the year after our statewide elections, we're the only two states with statewide elections the year after a presidential election. And so they're often seen as harbingers of what might happen in the midterm elections at the national level. And the political science literature shows very clearly that whoever is in power at the presidential level, their party tends to lose seats in the midterm congressional elections. So for example, if a president, when the Democratic Party won the presidency in 2020, then in 2022, the prediction would be that the Democratic Party would lose seats. And again, since President Trump won the election, the Republican Party is predicted to lose seats in the 2026 election at the midterm. That would be a pattern that's existed for decades in American politics. But the Virginia and New Jersey elections are often seen as telling us how much things might change at the midterm elections. And so that's the sense in which our elections in New Jersey tend to get nationalized, basically, and people at the national level pay attention. Now, there are lots of other reasons that people were paying attention to New Jersey and Virginia and to the New York mayor's election this year as well. So in 2017, both Virginia and New Jersey elected Democrats to the governor's offices, and then the Democrats also gained seats significantly in the 2018 election. So that's kind of why national political pundits pay attention to the New Jersey election. So it's also important to remember, though, that state and local elections are also state and local elections. And so voters are making decisions not just based on whatever political pundits think at the national level. They're making decisions based on what they're concerned about in their communities and in their state. So voters make decisions about what is happening in their communities and what they think and what they know about their candidates. So all of that, so the fact that our elections in New Jersey get nationalized in certain kinds of ways is important to know, but it's also important to know that people are still voting for their local candidates. So that's context for thinking about the 2025 election results. National election observers look to these results as predictive. And there's some truth in that. And people have been paying attention also to, for example, the referendum in California and to other elections as well. But if we look at what voters seem to be concerned about in the three most watched elections, that is Virginia, New Jersey, and the New York mayor's election, affordability was something that all of the winning candidates talked about. And that's certainly a national issue with inflation and with housing being so unaffordable in many communities, and there being just a shortage of housing, for example. So affordability is a common theme, but that might be a national issue, and yet it also has local and state features to it. So, for example, when you think about how the three candidates, Mikey Sherrill, Abigail Spanberger, and Zohran Mamdani talked about affordability. They each talked about affordability in very different ways, right? So and those were all related to what the concerns of their constituents, their potential constituents were. So, for example, in New Jersey, utility costs are going up quite steeply. And so Mikey Sherrill campaigned on utility costs. Well, that's not an issue that Spanberger or Mamdani really talked about with their electorates, because those are issues those issues might be different in different locations. So it's important to when you think about like what does this election mean, it means it has national ramifications, but it also people are still running for the constituency that they represent. And so it's also state and local as well. So it's also important, one thing to note about the New Jersey and Virginia elections, these, as they call them, off-year elections. It's also important to notice that the electorate is different. So who comes out to vote, that is. So who comes out to vote for a presidential election is a little bit different from who comes out to vote for a midterm congressional election and who comes out to vote for a state election. So presidential elections in the US have get the most attention and have the highest turnout. Midterm elections have lower turnout than presidential elections. And off-year state and local elections attract a lower turnout than presidential elections, but also a different set of voters. They tend to be more engaged voters. But also, again, it's going to depend on what's going on locally and what's going on in the state in terms of what people are paying attention to. One of the historic factors of the New Jersey election was this is the first time since I believe in the 1960s that it's the third time the same party will be holding the governorship. In New Jersey, we tend to switch back and forth between parties. So one of the reasons that people were thinking Mikey Sherrill might not win this election is just because people are ready for change. And in New Jersey, we tend to change governors every 8 years at least. We change the party of the governor. So the fact that she won so significantly was not what people would have predicted. So it's a different set of voters. So one of the reasons you can compare presidential elections to off-year to New Jersey state elections in certain ways, but sometimes it's a different electorate that comes out. And in New Jersey, we also we've added some features to our voting recently. We've got early voting now. And we've made it easier for people to do mail-in voting. And so those have also added to ways that people can vote that does tend to increase turnout when there are more options for voting rather than just election day. Nevertheless, it is significant. One of the things that happened is that different people turned out for the 2025 New Jersey election than turned out in New Jersey in 2024 for the presidential election. But of the same people who turned out, some of them switched their votes from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Another significant thing about the New Jersey election is that every county shifted left, basically shifted to more Democratic support. The Democrats got more support in every single county, even though, of course, Sherrill did not win every county in New Jersey, but every county had a shift to the left. And some of that was different people coming out. That's why I'm making the point about the electorate. But some of that was also that some of the people who voted for President Trump in 2024 changed their votes. How do we know that? Because there's exit polling and people get asked, who did you vote for last year? Who did you vote for this year? And a significant percentage of people did shift their votes, especially in Hudson County and in Passaic County. Those were the two counties that had the greatest shift from the 2024 election to the 2025 election. So those are just a few of the things to think about in terms of how to interpret but not overinterpret the results of the 2025 state elections.
Thank you for calming down my enthusiasm, Professor Josephson. Okay, turning to you, Professor Aziz.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Alem. It's a pleasure to be sharing the virtual floor with you and Professor Josephson, and thanks to the students and everyone else who is interested in this topic. So I thought I would start. I'm going to use a PowerPoint because I want to show a little bit of data to give some backdrop and some context, and then maybe during the conversation in the Q&A, we can go into the details. So let me quickly share my screen. Okay. So, well, that's right. Okay. So first, I want to talk about race and politics, and which is a very big topic, but I want to focus on Hispanic voters, Black voters, and Muslim voters to the extent that there is some data available and to put it into context. And Professor Josephson alluded to some of these trends where we have seen, this is based on the Pew Research Center, we have seen African American voters, and it appears to be more or higher among men, African American men, that have increased their votes to the Republican Party for Trump in 2024. So I just highlighted kind of what stands out there is that 15% of African Americans voted for Trump in 2024 compared to only 6% in 2016 for the Republican Party or for Trump. Now, that's still very low, 15%, but as a percentage, it's almost 300% increase. And again, most of it we see within African American male voting, as you can see on the graph. The other change came from Hispanic American voters, where 48% of Hispanic American voters voted for Trump in 2024, as compared to 28% in 2016. And again, here you see that it's the women actually that have a higher vote for the the Hispanic women who have increased their vote for Trump. And so the question becomes why, and then how does this 2025 election fare for the 2028 elections? Next is looking at how Latinos, and this will help us kind of maybe understand what just happened and what may happen in 2028, is that 70% of Latinos, again, according to the Pew Research Center, and this is a poll taken in September of 2025, just a little less than 2 months ago, that 70% of Latinos feel very strong, 70% of Latinos surveyed very strongly disapprove of the way Trump is handling his job as president. And 60% of Latinos strongly disapprove or somewhat disapprove of Trump's approach to immigration. And I think many of us know why they feel so strongly around immigration is because of the ICE raids and because of this Gestapo-like detentions and arrests and raids on homes, on workplaces, on stores and malls, concerts, that has really created a sense of fear among Latino communities who have been disproportionately targeted by Trump's touted quota of, I believe he wants to deport 1 million people a year out of the United States. And the Latino community has been disproportionately harmed by that policy. Now, I want to quickly, before I get there, sorry, I skipped one slide. Excuse me. Then I want to just point out a predictable outcome of that, which is that 68% of Hispanic voters, again, this is October 2025, say that compared with a year ago, the situation has worsened for Hispanics. And yes, there is certainly a class, an economic component to that, which is shared among many Americans of the higher cost of living and higher rent and et cetera, as Professor Josephson mentioned. But much of it is also from this sense of fear that in any minute, in any day, members of their family could be arrested, could be kidnapped effectively, just disappeared into prisons, to immigration detention facilities. And oftentimes they don't know where they are. They don't know how to find them. And it takes them days. And if not, before their family members have already, been deported. So that's something to keep an eye out for 2028. Now, I want to switch a little bit to Muslims, which is a community that's not studied often, and possibly because they only comprise 1% of the US population, although they get a disproportionate amount of negative media coverage, usually portrayed as terrorists, portrayed as anti-Semitic, portrayed as hateful, misogynistic. And so that's much of the subject of my work on countering Islamophobia and racism against Palestinians and Arabs and South Asians. And I'll put a plug in for my book, The Racial Muslim, that gives you a nice big overview and theory of why that happens. But if you look at the Muslim population and you're trying to understand kind of race and politics, it's much more difficult because of the diversity. So as you can see, 30%, this is again according to the Pew Research Pew Research Center, and it's July 2023 until March 2024, is they found that 30% of Muslims are white or categorized as white, 20% are Black, 30% are Asian, and 11% are Hispanic, which is actually I think that's a doubling from the last census, and then 8% are other or mixed. And I just want to point out that the reason why many of the 30% that are white, many of them are actually North African and Middle Eastern, because under the census they are categorized as white or Caucasian. So that 30%, a substantial number, I mean, around 80 to 90% of that are Middle Eastern and North Africans, people of that origin. Okay. And then I want to show you the just a little bit about the demographics of Muslims so that you understand maybe help understand their voting patterns. They are more likely than other Americans to have a college degree. So 26% of Muslims have a college degree, and 18% of them have, or excuse me, 26% are college grads and 18% are post grads. So that is higher than the average American, right? All U.S. adults, and it's also higher than other than Christians and then religiously unaffiliated. And based on other polls I've seen, it's about the same, if not a little bit lower than Jewish Americans, who also have higher rates of education or college education and postgraduate education than the average American population. And then let's look at how they vote politically. So since 9/11, at least, most Muslims, and this is in flux right now, you have 53% are leaning Democrat, which I would argue is probably lower than before 2024. There is a significant number, similar to what we saw with Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, where you have a percentage of Muslim voters who have started to vote for Trump. The facts aren't clear. We don't have all the data to show why, but some of the theories are on social conservative issues, issues. They're very conservative, and also on business issues because of not wanting to pay taxes if they're small businesses or if they are affluent. But again, that's more based on news reporting. And then finally, Muslims' views on government size, racial diversity, and immigration do more closely mirror Democratic than Republican attitudes. So as you can see, they would rather have a bigger government providing more services at 71%, as compared to 55% of all U.S. adults. 82% of them support racial and ethnic diversity and believe it strengthens America, and 82% support America's openness to immigrants is essential to its identity as a nation. And that is consistent with the fact that many of them are immigrants themselves or children of immigrants due to changes in immigration laws after 1965 that allowed more people from the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia to immigrate to the U.S., when before that they were otherwise excluded. But on social conservative issues such as prayer, LGBTQ, religion in public spaces, they actually tend to vote more, but they tend to support Republican policy. So I'll just end with this, which we can talk about during the Q&A, which is an op-ed that I had written right before Mamdani was elected. And again, not knowing whether he was going to win or not, but just to discuss, and if you have time, take a look at this on Middle East Eye, is to essentially argue that the race baiting that we saw was pretty explicit Islamophobia. It was not subtle. It was not dog whistle politics. It was, and it was chronic and frequent and persistent. And it was by the highest levels of government in ways that we really hadn't seen since the early 1900s, where that was how the first Catholic and the first Jewish politicians would be defamed. and subjected to racial slurs and epithets. And so effectively, I'm just showing that unfortunately we're seeing this repeat of history. And I think what's more perverse is that a number of the people who were engaging in the race baiting that was very Islamophobic against Mamdani themselves were descendants of Catholic Americans and Italian Americans who, 3 generations ago, this was their reality, this type of just overt racism and impediments to their ability to enter politics. Beyond just the usual mudslinging that's based on policy differences. So I'm happy to go into more detail on that. And then for those who do not follow the Center for Security, Race and Rights, I'd be remiss not to just put a pitch in. Follow us on social media. We've got a Race and Rights podcast. We're also on YouTube. And with that, I will end, and I look forward to our discussion.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Aziz, and thank you so much, Professor Josephson, for such an insightful insight and for such a comprehensive analysis. These are such fascinating data, and the story behind them and what they tell us is extremely important and significant in this moment, in this political life that we are experiencing. I have follow-up questions to Professor Josephson as well to Professor Aziz. We will turn it again to you, Professor Josephson, and I wanted to hear a little bit more from you on the gender aspect of the elections. So given that, women occupy about 28% of the congressional seats and that number has barely budged compared to the previous cycles, and given the data that Professor Aziz has shared with us, in your view, what is the political and the symbolic value of, that first women or more women victories as governors, as state legislators, as mayors at this moment? Especially when such gains remain modest overall, and more importantly, and that's my Middle Eastern skepticism. That's my Middle Eastern skepticism kicking in. More importantly, how can we ensure that these gains translate into actual policy shifts on gender, on economic justice, on care, rather than, token representation? And I want to add as well that I did drop my email in the chat. Please email me your questions to Professor Josephson and Professor Aziz. On to you, Professor Josephson.
Great. So I wanted to just mention that if you want to look at if you have questions about gender and American elections, the best place to look is the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers. Rutgers, New Brunswick has the Center for American Women in Politics, and they have all kinds of data going back decades on gender and elections, gender, race, ethnicity, and elections, right? So it looks at both voter behavior and also at candidates. So I guess one thing I would say is that since 1980, there has been a gender gap in voting behavior, in how people vote. And some of the data that Professor Aziz talked about makes reference to this as well. But the gender gap is just the difference between the percentage of women who vote for a candidate and the percentage of men who vote for a candidate. So, for example, if all the women who voted, 55% of them voted for, let's say, Governor-elect Sherrill. It's actually higher than that. And 45% of men voted for Governor-elect Sherrill. The gender gap would be 10 percentage points, right? That's what the gender gap is. So, and of course, there's gender and race and ethnicity gap, right? And there's a gender gap among racial and ethnic groups, as well as there are differences between how women of different racial and ethnic groups vote as well. I'm mentioning the gender gap just to say that Governor-elect Sherrill, there was a 13-point gender gap. Okay, so more women than men voted for Sherrill, right? And she received 62% of the votes of women, of all women who voted for the governor's office, and she received 49% of the votes of men who voted for the governor's office. So there we're talking about that's voting behavior, who voted for Governor-elect Sherrill. But among women, yes. So her strongest support, though, this varied by different racial and ethnic groups. So her strongest was support. 95% of Black women voted for Governor-elect Sherrill. 73% of Latinas voted for Governor-elect Sherrill. Okay, and actually, 54% of white women voters in New Jersey voted for Governor-elect Sherrill. Now that's different from what happened in the 2024 presidential election, where the majority of white women in New Jersey voted for, and the majority of white women nationally, it's a little bit over 50%, voted for President Trump. So there's a little bit of difference among the white women in the electorate in New Jersey than nationally. They tend more Democratic. All right. So, but then your question was more also about representation, right? So does it matter that we have now our second woman governor in New Jersey? Does it matter that Virginia has the first woman governor? And yes, it does. But we need to talk about two different kinds of representation, which your question alluded to, Professor Alam. The question is, there's descriptive representation, right? Do the people who are elected to represent the electorate, do they look like the electorate, basically, right? How similar are they to the electorate? And of course, historically, that's not been true, right? And it's been shifting over the last several decades, when first more white women were running for office, then more women of all races were running for office. And so there's been a shift, but it's been slow. It's been very gradual. And as you mentioned, Professor Alam, it's kind of stalled. So in this new Congress, the 20, as you said, 28% of the members of Congress are women, but there's a partisan difference also in who is between the parties. There's a difference between the parties. So more than 40% of the Democrats in Congress are women, whereas less than 20% of the Republicans in Congress are women. So there's a party difference in terms of who gets elected. Now that is, so I mentioned descriptive representation, and then your question is also about substantive representation. Once they get there, do the people who are elected to represent the women who are voting for these candidates, do they actually represent the interests of those women, however those interests are perceived, right? And there's a relationship, but it does, historically there have been studies, once women, especially one of the differences, women tended to win office in state legislatures first, and then started to get into executive positions at the state level. Then they started to win more offices in Congress. Obviously, we've had women candidates for president who have not won, right? And so one of the historic differences is that voters often tend to see women as more suited for legislative office than for executive office. So one of the things that was very interesting about both Spanberger and Sherrill is they both have, Spanberger was in the CIA, right? Sherrill has a military background. That has historically been, of course, a way for men to see themselves as qualified. But that's also, obviously, it was an asset for those two women candidates as well. So women have been slower to be in executive office, especially to win governorships, than to win state legislative office or to win office in Congress. And actually, the COP data also shows that very few women go from Congress, like Governor-elect Sherrill is going from being a member of Congress to being a governor. That's a rather unusual political career path. People more commonly come through state government in some kind of way into the governor's office. So does it matter that there are women? The historic studies of women, especially in state legislatures and then more recently in Congress, show that it does matter, that even women who don't run as women to say that they are going to represent women's interests. Once they got to state legislatures, and I'm talking about the literature for the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s, once they got to state office, they saw how women's interests were not being represented. And so some women started taking on issues related to women's interests. But it usually took a certain percentage of the legislature to be women before that could really happen. So there needed to be 15 to 20% of the body needed to be women before women's interests could really get heard. And that happened in states throughout the country before it happened in Congress. So that doesn't mean that women's interests will be represented when there are women in Congress, right? It depends on what their party ideology is, but it depends even more on social movements, right? It depends on people pressuring their representatives to actually do what they want to do. So if you want substantive representation, it's important to elect candidates who are related to the issues that you want to have represented. But it's also very important for grassroots organizations to pressure public officials to actually do to keep their promises, basically. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, excellent. That is fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor Josephson. Turning to you, Professor Aziz, and I wanna hear more from you on your recent piece on race baiting attacks against Zohran Mamdani, it was such a clever and pointed critique. So as you mentioned, the piece frames his campaign and the reaction to it as part of the long American tradition of racialized political contestation. So my question is, or I would like to invite you to expand on how Memdani's victory as the first Muslim, South Asian, New York City mayor, how it appears to break new grounds. But as we know, such breakthroughs often trigger a backlash or surge of racialized and identity-based attacks. So in your assessment, how do firsts like this, how do they both challenge and risk reinforcing racial polarization? And what strategies should progressive coalitions adopt to defend such victories against race baiting and to transform them into an inclusive governance rather than, a symbolic individual wins?
Well, thank you. These are tough questions to ask, and I always enjoy reading the political science, just empirical studies, trying to answer these otherwise, because I'm, as a law professor, we answer things normatively. And let me start by just reciting some facts to give people perspective about Mamdani. He did some pretty remarkable things that many of his own supporters didn't expect. So one is he turned out 2 million New Yorkers to vote for mayor, and there hasn't been that level of voter turnout since 1969. When John Lindsay won a second term. So it was an incumbent mayor. So he wasn't even an incumbent. He defeated Cuomo among college graduates, 57% to 38%. And he also received 32% of Jewish voters, even though the Islamophobic and race baiting attacks against him was that he was anti-Semitic because he supported the human rights of Palestinians and supported enforcing international law when it came to Israel's violation of many of those laws, including accusations of committing a genocide in Gaza. He also shifted 47 New York City neighborhoods, at least 20, let me restate that. In 2024, Trump shifted 47 New York City neighborhoods, at least 25 points towards him. Mamdani won 37 of those 47 neighborhoods. So going back to what Professor Josephson said is at least if, to the extent that New York is a harbinger of 2028, this is showing some very big changes or kind of backlash and reversals. And the reason why I think that's significant isn't just because of the partisan difference or switch, but because, again, you're talking about the first Muslim to run for mayor and be a serious finalist, a candidate, and to win. And the people, at least of New York, that showed up to vote didn't fall for any of that race baiting. So the question becomes why? Is it that New York is just a very unique, special place that really doesn't represent the United States? Could be one. Is it that this is a indication of the change in young people's approach to elections and race? Because if you look at the age differentials, Mamdani won 3/4 of the voters under the age of 30. So the younger the voter, the more percentage of the votes he obtained, which means the future, right? Now maybe they'll change their preferences as they get older, but that's also an indication of that. So I think what was unique about the Mamdani election is that all of this race baiting failed when in the past it has been quite successful. The race baiting and the Islamophobia has targeted elected officials that are Muslim, candidates that are Muslim, faculty, students, professionals, influencers. It has become completely acceptable in the American society to be overtly anti-Muslim and to engage in concerted defamation campaigns against Muslims who are successful in their professions or in politics. And again, in ways that we really haven't seen since, a century ago, when it was ordinary to do that towards Catholics and towards Jews and towards Blacks and towards Latinos. So it's that disparity that I think is so alarming. And so I think it's really about the young generation, because if you look at the age groups, the older voters are not, they seem to be falling for the race baiting, especially when it comes to Muslims. We also saw the first Muslim woman be elected to a state level office in Virginia. Azela Hashmi was voted for as lieutenant governor in Virginia. That is a very significant accomplishment. So the question is, will she then spend most of her time and waste most of her time having to deal with misogynistic Islamophobic attacks against her by spoilers and people who essentially don't want her to be in office? It's beyond just partisan opposition, but it becomes very personal and racialized. Or will she be able to actually do the work, and then we can judge her, as Professor Josephson explained, is she a woman who actually cares about women's issues? And will that affect, or will she be so busy and distracted, which is part of the strategy of this race baiting, that she won't be able to accomplish anything because she'll be just trying to convince people that she is a human being, right? That she's competent, that she's not anti-Semitic, that she's not dangerous, that she's not disloyal or supporting terrorists. And this is a common experience that African Americans had to deal with and still have to deal with when they get elected, is having to prove themselves in ways that the majority group doesn't have to do. So I'm not optimistic. It is an empirical question, which I don't have the answer to yet. And I'll leave it to the political scientists. But if I look at how Rashida Tlaib has been treated, if I look at how Ilhan Omar has been treated, I remember when Keith Ellison was in the U.S. Congress, he wanted to swear in on the Quran, and he did, and that was as if he was committing treason. And I remember thinking, what's the big deal, right? If somebody was Jewish and they wanted to swear in on their holy book, nobody would say anything. And if they did, it would be clearly anti-Semitic. And yet, with Keith Ellison, who was an African-American Muslim, it was considered completely legitimate to challenge his loyalty because he wanted to swear his oath of office on his own religious holy book. So anyway, when you look at Rashida Tlaib, when you look at Ilhan Omar, they're frequently attacked in very Islamophobic ways, and yet they are still there. So that's also a positive development. So I think a lot of it is generational. And what I believe the current administration and Steve Miller, who I think is probably the white supremacist in chief that is implementing, all of these deportations and abductions and arbitrary arrests and mass, immigration detention, I think their biggest fear, and actually I don't think they've said it, is that America will not be a white majority country. And they seem to have accepted, maybe wrongfully or rightly, I don't know if the data supports it, but they seem to have accepted that if you have more diversity racially and ethnically, you will have policies and laws in a society that is less racist and that will not provide the same amount of privilege, legally, normatively, economically, to those who are kind of collectively raced as white. And that is causing them all of this nativist angst, which is exactly what we saw in the early 1900s against Protestants and Jews against Catholics and Jews by Protestants that were against all immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, and excluded all Asians from even coming, and of course, oftentimes supported Jim Crow. So this isn't new, but again, I think these are really great research questions for the empiricists to see if there's any correlation. But I guess I'll just end by saying that the youth are the future politicians, right? They're the future. So we should be looking at the trends, the people in their 20s and their 30s. And unless there is data that shows that they generally tend to change positions just based on age, that will tell us where we're going. And I think if Mamdani's election tells us anything, I think we may start to finally see more diverse representation of at least Muslims in political office, and we will see the backlash against them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Aziz. So few of the questions that I received are asking you to bring out your crystal ball and to answer, to predict what that means for the next cycle of elections. And what does that mean for the presidential election? So some of the anxieties is that, are we going to witness a backlash because of these wins? So should we prepare ourselves to a backlash because of these firsts and wins where the old reasserts its dominance on politics?
Well, I'm happy to start on that, at least on the race and ethnicity. So I would just say that there's two different questions. One is whether the backlash exists, and the second, more important one, is whether the backlash is effective in reversing progress. So I have yet to be convinced that the first won't happen, because I just think history shows that. We're seeing it with Trump's policies and his rhetoric and the people that he's appointed. Is the entire Trump administration, I think, is backlash against DEI, backlash against the Palestine Solidarity movement, student movement in particular, and backlash against all forms of LGBTQ rights and civil rights, etc. But the question is, will it be effective? And I think that's really up to the voters. I think if people disagree and they show up like they did in 2025, like, for example, the Hispanic voters who clearly said, this is not acceptable to us. We may have voted for you 2 years ago, but you're destroying our communities, you're destroying our families, you're putting us in this constant state of fear, and you're not even necessarily, producing what we thought you would in terms of the reasons we voted for you. We're going to switch our votes. So the most important thing is not allowing the backlash to be effective. And I think that's another thing that Mamdani did very well, and he's probably the first one to have done it so well, is he was able to absorb all that hate and all that anger, and all that kind of malice, and just take it with stride and say, look, if you are someone who doesn't want that toxicity, and if you want someone who is focused on the policies and focused on New Yorkers and focused on the things I have committed to that are very social welfare oriented for lower income and lower middle income New Yorkers, vote for me. If you want to be with all these very hateful, negative people, you can stay in that camp. And I think the voters voted with their feet, right? Even, I mean, I think the fact that 32% of Jewish voters voted for Mamdani after a concerted Islamophobic campaign to try to paint him as this hateful anti-Semite shows that they didn't fall for that. And I don't think it's because 32% of them agree with him on Palestine, Israel. I think if they sat down and they were to compare their analysis or conclusions or thought about what's happening in Palestine, Israel, I think they disagree. But they understood that this is the mayor and he's going to vote for us. He's an American like us. And they were, a lot of them were young, and so they could connect with him culturally. And it worked. Now, again, I don't know if that's unique to New York. I think that's where I get a little bit hesitant to be optimistic. But we should keep an eye on, we actually, the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights is about to publish a big policy report that's going to talk about what happens to Muslims when they run for office. It's a normative, qualitative kind of case study analysis to demonstrate, the ways in which when Muslims actually play within the system and when they are running for office and when they win, they end up overburdened in ways that non-Muslims or non-minorities deal with. I mean, you can use it for women or other minorities. And that we need to figure out how to make that stop and how voters can rebuke that so that it is no longer a successful electoral strategy. And therefore, the opponent won't race bait because it won't get them votes and it won't get them donations. But as long as the race baiting gets votes and donations, they're going to keep doing it because they don't seem to care at all about the hate it creates for that entire community with that identity. So again, we as the voters, we have to literally vote with our feet. And the young people are the key to changing this. It's really, I think, people under the age of 40 just need to show up and they need to vote based on their values. And that's a very strong collective message to make the backlash ineffective.
That's great. I don't have a crystal ball, but one thing I wanted to mention that I didn't mention before, I do think, I mean, there is the historic trend that midterm elections usually are, favor the party that's out of power, and that. But that doesn't mean it just happens, right? So to me, part of what Spanberger and Cheryl and Mamdani all did very well was they did retail politics. They talked to people. They did, Cheryl was in every single county in New Jersey talking to people. And Mamdani was everywhere in New York, right? And so I think that part of what has sometimes happened in American politics is that parties that don't tend to win elections in certain areas give up on those areas, right? And just don't even try, don't even campaign in those areas. And so there are many state legislative seats that aren't even contested, right? So I think part of what I hope that especially the Democratic Party is learning is that they need to be really a big tent, and be a tent that can keep Mamdani and Spanberger and others more centrist as well as part of that big tent, because that's the only way you can win national elections in the US, right? So I think that sometimes losing is very instructive. And so being out of power, being in the wilderness for a decade, basically, even though there were a lot of things that happened during the Biden presidency, but nevertheless, I think the Democratic Party feels like it's been in the wilderness for the entire time that Trump has been in power and the Republican Party, right? So I do think that there have been some lessons learned, I guess, but not even just not in partisan politics. I do think that part of what we've seen with this shift among the electorate is that public officials who want to get elected need to talk to their constituents, and need to really listen to their constituents. One thing I didn't mention when I was mentioning data is that in New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill got 81% of women voters between the age of 18 and 29. Okay, so young women voters voted overwhelmingly for Cheryl. Young men, I think it's let's see, Yes, so 50%, 57% of men in that same age range voted for Cheryl. So there's an even bigger gender gap, so that's going to be something that's interesting for people of your generation to think about in terms of how you do organizing and how you talk to one another about politics. Just one other thing, I teach an organizing class and we talk about relational organizing. A lot of uh, politicians are now talking about doing relational organizing at the electoral level as well, right? And they just mean talking to people, right? And so, that's the most important thing, both not just for an elected official, but for anyone who wants to make a difference in politics, is talking to your neighbors, right? So I don't have a crystal ball, but I do think that the more that we can talk with one another, the better that it will be for the future of American politics.
Okay, excellent. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Aziz, and thank you so much, Professor Josephson, for sharing your insights, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your wisdom. I trust that our audience have found this incredibly fascinating and informative and useful. And thank you to our audience for your energy and for your presence. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you again for being part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.